In this video we will explore some of the tactics and tricks which may be used against you in games of Warmaster. The Warmaster rule set ensures that all armies are viable, so every tactic used against you can be countered. Let's look at some examples. Armies that have access to flyers have a definite mobility advantage over their opponents. In this example, the chariots have moved up, ensuring that the enemy flyers are in their forward arc, whilst the hill blocks the flyers' line of sight for a charge. However, the flyers have another tactic available to them. At the start of their turn, the flyers home back towards a character. This has now put them in the enemy's flank arc. The flyers now have line of sight to the chariots, so all that is required is a successful charge order from the character, and the flyers can now successfully attack the chariots in the flank. This tactic is very hard to defend against, although it does require some good luck to pull off. The tactic is reliant upon firstly a good home-back roll and then a successful charge order from the character. You can mitigate against this tactic, for example by using terrain and less valuable units to protect the flanks and rear of your key troops. Flying units are generally monsters, which means they're very good on the attack but quite weak in defence. So if your army has access to flyers themselves, you can use your flyers to attack the enemy flyers. In this example, the eagles and carrion are on opposite sides of a hill and cannot see each other. In their turn, one player moves the eagles behind the carrion, turning to face them and threaten a rear charge. In their turn, the carrion player could home back away from the eagles, but they could employ this tactic instead. Here, the carrion have been deployed with one stand facing the rear of the unit. As this is irregular formation, it limits the flyers to a half-pace move. But flyers are unique in that a half-pace move for them is still 100 centimeters. So with one stand deployed facing the rear of the units, the carrion have effectively got an almost 360-degree line of sight with no reduction in movement, and they are free to charge the eagles in their turn. Now let's look at one of the most hated tactics in all of Warmaster. In this example, the character on the hill has ordered undead chariots to charge Albion chariots, whilst flyers lurk in reserve. The character then orders the flyers to land directly behind the enemy chariots in the engagement. As the flyers are less than a centimetre away from the chariots, if the chariots lose the combat and retreat, they will automatically be destroyed by the enemy flyers. This is especially devastating when it happens to a unit of extremely valuable troops, such as the battle report where Undead charged a brigade of Bretonnian knights, dropped some flyers in behind, and then wiped the knights out. One way to prevent this from happening is to deploy cavalry brigades in two lines. For example, if the enemy charged the Direwolf cavalry and put flyers behind the Black Knight cavalry, the Black Knights would be safe. As cavalry can't support, they wouldn't be included in the combat featuring the Direwolves, so wouldn't have to retreat into the flyers. In this example, eagles have been landed behind Dark Elf infantry, whilst Silverhelms charge the front. However, the infantry is deployed in three lines. This means the rearmost unit is not involved in the combat and won't have to retreat into the eagles. Instead, the rearmost unit simply makes way to the side when the front units retreat. This prevents the eagles from wiping them out. Furthermore, the Dark Elf player has positioned units at the rear of their army, which can countercharge the eagles next turn. Another good use for flyers is to inflict command penalties on the enemy. Because flyers have such a great movement range, it is relatively easy to drop them behind the enemy lines, even on the first turn. So here the carrion have flown behind the enemy chariots, imposing a -1 command penalty on them. This helps to slow down the enemy advance and also forces the enemy to react to your move by deploying resources to deal with the flyers. One way to counter this is to deploy your army in several lines so the flyers have nowhere safe to land. Another countermeasure is to deploy some of your own units facing towards the rear of your army to countercharge any flyers that land behind. How do your infantry beat enemy cavalry? One way is the Infantry Trap. Here we have deployed missile infantry in defensible terrain which is impassable to cavalry. Quite often, missile units such as these will be left in the defensible terrain for the remainder of the battle, and this tactic relies upon your opponent expecting them to do so. Every good trap needs bait, in this case a vulnerable artillery unit. The enemy move up their chariots to attack the artillery, but fail to get the charge order off, leaving the chariots in the open. The enemy chariots' flanks are now also exposed to our infantry. In our turn, the infantry can use their initiative to charge out of their defensible positions, catching the chariots in both flanks. Even the weakest missile infantry have a good chance of defeating enemy heavy cavalry in this manner. And you may be pleasantly surprised to discover how often this tactic works in the heat of battle when your opponent is not paying attention. Artillery, like all other units, must fire at the closest visible target. You can exploit this by placing less valuable troops in front of more valuable troops, forcing artillery to waste its shots on chaff. In this example, the cannon want to shoot at the chariots, but can't do so as they carry another closer target. So to focus our artillery fire, we move a unit of infantry to prevent the carrion being the closest target. The artillery now has no line of sight to the carrion and is free to shoot at the chariots. Even when you have been soundly beaten in combat, there are tactics that you can use to mitigate your losses. In this example, 2 units of crossbowmen have been caught outside of their defensive position by enemy chariots and carrion. The crossbowmen suffer sufficient casualties to remove an entire stand and are forced to retreat. In a multiple combat such as this, the retreating unit must retreat away from the greater number of touching enemy stands. As the owning player chooses which stands are removed, you can use this to force the direction of the retreat in your favour. So by removing one stand in contact with the carrion, the greater number of touching stands is now the chariots, so we retreat away from them into the safety of the woods. Certain unit types in Warmaster have special rules which force them to use their initiative to charge the enemy. In this example, ogres have to charge units of humans, and we can exploit this by moving suitable bait units so they are just within initiative range of the ogres. This means when the ogres have to charge, only one stand from each ogre unit can make contact with our troops. This minimises the damage that the ogres can cause to our units. It also splits the ogres up into 2 separate engagements, and even if the ogres were to win, they cannot pursue our bait units, as we are using chariots to bait infantry. Warmaster is a game of dice, and as the saying goes, no plan survives contact with the dice. However, knowing the risks is half the battle, and you can reduce the chance of failure by making informed decisions about which units to move first and which characters to use to order them. For example, if you have a critical order to make this turn, which could be the difference between winning or losing the game, don't be afraid to use your general to make that order, even if it's the first order of your turn. Some players can fall into the mindset of only using their general to order last, because when the general fails to order, the command phase is over. But don't forget, provided the general succeeds in his orders, you can move on to other characters after he has finished. It is also useful to plan the order of your combat engagements around the chances of success. If you choose to fight a combat engagement you are likely to lose first of all, you may give the enemy opportunity to pursue or advance with their own units into other combat engagements, allowing them to tip the balance of power further into their favour. In this example, the Roman player decides to charge their cavalry into defended missile infantry on a hill. The enemy infantry is supported, and the Romans are very unlikely to win this combat. To try and tip the balance in their favour, the Roman player uses 2 command rolls to order another unit of cavalry to charge the infantry in the flank. This is not the best use of cavalry, as they will not get any charge bonus. They'll be hitting the enemy on 5s instead of 4s, and the enemy get to stand and shoot them as they charge home. The result of this combat is that the cavalry lose their engagement and are forced to retreat. This in turn allows the enemy infantry to reposition after combat and set up a flank charge for next turn. So now that we have explored some of the tactics and tricks available to a general in the game of Warmaster, the question you need to ask yourself is, just because these tactics are available, should I use them? Will employing such tactics reduce your enjoyment of the game? Is it worth making the game less enjoyable for your opponent in order for you to win? Within your local gaming circle, it's entirely appropriate to come to an agreement and decide which, if any, of such tactics are acceptable and which are not. However, if you regularly enjoy playing competitive games in tournaments, be aware that all these tactics are legal and supported by the rules. This means you should expect to face them, and hopefully this video has provided you with some solutions that will allow you to deal with these tactics when they occur.